Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that explorer John C. Frémont, or Kit Carson, was known as the Pathfinder's Pathfinder as he worked to help map and explore the American West? Learn how Carson guided expeditions through the Rocky Mountains to the Great Salt Lake, traveled to California, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest, how he served during the Mexican-American War, and later in the American Civil War, became a federal Indian agent with the Utes and Apache tribes, and spoke Spanish and French fluently, along with several Native American languages.
You know, usually when we talk about creating a map, especially a map that literally defines the expansion of an entire nation, there's this expectation of extreme, almost like academic precision.
Oh, absolutely.
You picture a scholar in a candlelit room, right? Surrounded by compasses and heavy leather-bound atlases, just calculating longitudinal lines with complex mathematics.
It's a very formal, highly educated image, yeah. I mean, we naturally think of cartography as a hard science.
Right.
Something completely reserved for the academic elite.
Yeah.
Especially in the 19th century when mapping new territory was, well, it was basically the equivalent of a modern space program.
Exactly. But then you step into the reality of the 19th century American West, and suddenly that whole academic image just completely shatters.
It really does.
We're looking at a historical landscape that completely defies those expectations because we have this stack of sources today that present a massive contradiction.
A really fascinating one.
Yeah. How does a kid who never spent a single day in a classroom and, who never even learned how to read a book end up effectively drawing the map of the American West?
It completely upends our understanding of what expertise actually looks like.
It really does.
The man we're looking at is Christopher Houston Carson, who's known to history as Kit Carson.
Right.
So he was born on December 24th, 1809, and died on May 23rd, 1868. And to understand his impact, you really have to look at his relationship with a man named John C. Frémont.
Oh, right, Frémont. He was the really famous explorer.
He was, yeah. Frémont was known to the entire country at the time as the Great Pathfinder. He was the literal face of American westward expansion.
Okay.
Yet Frémont himself referred to Kit Carson as
Right.
the Pathfinder's Pathfinder.
I mean, that is a massive title to bestow on someone.
Right.
The guy getting all the historical glory is actively deferring to a guy who couldn't read. So our mission for the deep dive today is to figure out why. We're going to explore how Carson shaped the nation, and we're utilizing excerpts from the text Kit Carson, the Pathfinder's Pathfinder.
It's a great source.
And eventually, we are actually going to look at a pretty surprising children's song to see how his story completely redefines what it means for you to be a pioneer in your own life today.
Yeah, to figure out how Carson became that ultimate guide, the Pathfinder's Pathfinder, we have to start with the context of his childhood.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So Carson grew up on the Missouri frontier. And in the early 1800s, Missouri was like the very edge of the known American world.
Just total wilderness.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And tragedy struck incredibly early for him. His father died in 1818.
Which would make Kit just 9 years old.
9 years old.
Yeah.
And that single event altered his entire trajectory. Because of his father's death, school was completely off the table.
Wow, yeah.
The burden of survival just fell so heavily on the family. He had to help support his mother and his 9 siblings.
9 siblings.
Yeah, massive family, which meant going straight into the grueling frontier workforce.
So instead of sitting in a classroom learning the alphabet, he becomes an apprentice to a saddle maker.
Right.
And then he's working as a manual laborer. Eventually, he's working as a trapper on a caravan of merchants heading down the Santa Fe Trail.
Which is incredibly dangerous work.
And by 1829, he's traveling through Arizona and California working for the Hudson Bay Company.
And this is where his lack of formal education forces a completely different kind of intellectual development.
How so?
Well, because of this total immersion in the frontier, moving between different territories and interacting with so many diverse groups, he develops incredible linguistic skills.
That part is just wild to me.
He learns to speak Spanish fluently, he learns French fluently, and he learns several Native American languages.
I was thinking about how impossible this sounds today. The best way I can describe it is it's like a modern, self-taught, tech genius learning fluency in 3 incredibly complex programming languages just by wandering around a server room.
That's a great way to put it.
And doing it despite never being able to read the instruction manual. You just absorb the syntax of the world around you.
Exactly. Because when you cannot rely on the written word, when you can't just like jot down vocabulary notes to memorize later.
Right. No flashcards.
Yeah, no flashcards, no looking up a verb conjugation in a grammar guide. Your brain has to compensate. Your working memory just has to expand massively.
Wow.
Carson's lack of formal education was completely offset by an elite level of adaptability and observational intelligence.
But how does that actually work in practice? I mean, if you can't read a translation dictionary, how are you picking up multiple distinct Native American languages?
To learn a language purely by ear in a survival environment, you really have to read people instead of paper.
Oh, that makes sense.
You are constantly observing body language, tone, context, the physical environment. If someone points to a river and says a word, you have to remember that exact sound, the context of the interaction, and how it relates to everything else they've ever said.
You're just reverse engineering it.
Exactly. You are reverse engineering complex grammar structures entirely in your head, just through social interaction.
Which requires intense, quiet observation.
Very much so.
And that level of observation clearly shaped his personality, because when you picture a 19th century mountain man, you picture a guy with a massive beard, causing chaos in a saloon, getting into brawls, just wild and rowdy.
The total Hollywood stereotype.
Right. But the sources note Carson was the exact opposite. He was known for his moderate and unassuming manner. Someone who actually knew him described his character by saying he was as clean as a hound's tooth.
It's a very vivid 19th century compliment.
Clean as a hound's tooth. I love that.
It basically meant he was fundamentally decent, reliable, and just uncorrupted by the rougher edges of frontier life. He wasn't loud or boastful. He listened.
And that unique combination, his organic language skills, his raw survival skills, and this highly observant, trustworthy nature, that made him the absolute perfect asset for the U.S. government's westward expansion.
It really did.
Which brings us to 1842. Carson is on a steamboat, and he bumps into John C. Frémont.
Right.
Now, Frémont is an officer with the United States Topographical Corps.
And let's define the Topographical Corps for a second, because it's crucial here. This wasn't just a military unit.
Right.
It was essentially the scientific exploration wing of the U.S. government.
Oh, okay.
Their mandate was to map the unknown territories of the West, assess the natural resources, and chart safe passage for future settlers. It was a massive, highly funded government enterprise.
And Frémont's literal job is to create these maps.
Exactly.
But he meets Carson and immediately hires him as his guide to lead his expedition to the South Pass in the Rocky Mountains.
And this is where Carson steps into the role of a cartographer, but in a completely unconventional way.
Because he can't draw the map.
Right. Because he couldn't read or write, he couldn't sit down and draft a topographical map. Instead, Carson created highly detailed descriptions of the terrain for the formal map makers to follow.
So break that down for me. If he isn't drawing lines on paper, how is he actually mapping?
It goes back to that elite observational intelligence we talked about. Carson was the eyes and the spatial memory of the expedition.
Wow.
While an academic cartographer relies on instruments to measure distance, Carson read the land itself. He had this incredible mental database of topographies.
So he just remembered everything he saw.
Yeah, knowing that a certain type of vegetation meant hidden water, or remembering the specific angle of a ridge he had crossed, like years prior.
That's insane.
He would translate that three-dimensional physical landscape into precise verbal data. He told Frémont's draftsmen where the passes were, what the gradients were like, where the hostile territories were.
And then they just translated his words into the lines on the map.
Exactly.
And it worked flawlessly. I mean, Frémont praised Carson in all of his official reports. They become this legendary duo.
They really do.
In 1843, Carson is guiding Frémont to survey the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Then they are traveling all the way up to Fort Vancouver in the Pacific Northwest.
Just massive distances.
And then there is this huge expedition from 1845 to 1846, charting the way to California and Oregon. It is thousands of miles of brutal, unknown wilderness.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. If
Sure.
Frémont is this highly educated officer in the Topographical Corps, and Carson is the one out front doing the actual guiding, keeping everyone alive, and providing the verbal data that makes the maps possible,
I see where you're going with this.
isn't Frémont basically just stealing the credit? I mean, is Frémont just a PR guy outsourcing his legacy to a guy who can't read?
It's so easy to look at it that way through a modern lens, but it was truly a symbiotic relationship.
Okay, how so?
Frémont brought things to the table that Carson simply couldn't. Frémont had the formal military backing, he secured the government funding,
Right.
he had the complex scientific instruments required for, precise latitudinal and longitudinal measurements.
Yeah.
And crucially, Frémont had the platform to write and publish the official reports that the American public and the government would actually consume.
Right, because Carson can't write the book on his own adventures.
Exactly. But Frémont was smart enough to know that all the funding and scientific instruments in the world were completely useless if your entire team died of exposure in the Rockies.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Carson had the on-the-ground genius required to actually survive. Frémont provided the macro purpose and the resources.
And Carson provided the micropath.
Precisely. That's why Frémont gave him that title, the Pathfinder's Pathfinder. Frémont knew where the nation needed to go, but Carson knew how to physically put one foot in front of the other to get them there.
But the West isn't just an empty, blank map waiting to be drawn.
Not at all.
There are people there. There are borders. And charting new territory meant Carson and Frémont inevitably collided head-on with the shifting geopolitical realities of the 1840s.
The landscape was changing rapidly. Because they were out there mapping, Carson and Frémont suddenly found themselves right in the middle of a military operation during the Mexican-American War.
Wow, just stumbled into a war.
Basically. They actively supported American settlers in California in an uprising known as the Bear Flag Revolt, which was an armed rebellion against the Mexican government.
So Carson transitions from a wilderness guide to an active soldier.
Right.
And after the war ends, he goes back to New Mexico and tries to settle down. He just wants to live as a rancher.
He tried.
But a guy with his specific set of linguistic and survival skills doesn't stay retired for long. By 1853, the government taps him for a totally new role.
And a really difficult one.
He becomes a federal Indian agent, working primarily with the Ute and Apache tribes.
A federal Indian agent in the 1850s was essentially a government liaison. Their job was to manage relations between the Native American tribes and the ever-expanding wave of white settlers.
Which had to be tense.
Oh, incredibly. They had to enforce treaties and try to keep the peace in an inherently volatile situation.
And the factual reality of Carson's stance during this time is so compelling, especially given his background. The sources explicitly state that Carson sympathized deeply with the Native Americans.
He did.
He fully understood their angry and desperate attacks on the settlers who were constantly pushing into their ancestral lands.
He saw the sheer desperation of these tribes. And to try and help them amidst this overwhelming, unstoppable wave of westward expansion, Carson actively advocated for the creation of Indian reservations.
Right.
Now, we view the reservation system through a very dark historical lens today.
Of course.
But at that exact moment in time, Carson saw it as the only viable way to physically protect these tribes from being completely wiped out by incoming settlers and to secure guaranteed land for them.
So it was really a protective measure in his mind.
Absolutely.
His role as a mediator and military man continued right through the Civil War. He serves as a lieutenant colonel, helping organize the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Infantry Regiment.
That's right.
By 1865, he is promoted to brigadier general. He actually helps negotiate a formal peace treaty with the Utes.
It's an incredible resume.
And he spends the final months of his life as the superintendent of Indian Affairs of the Colorado Territory before passing away in 1868. But, looking at that timeline, I have to just marvel at the psychological evolution of this man.
It is a massive arc.
Seriously, how does someone go from participating in an armed, violent uprising during the Bear Flag Revolt to sitting across a treaty table from the Utes and Apaches as a diplomatic voice of reason?
It's quite a shift.
To actually deeply understand and sympathize with the desperate attacks of the people who are technically fighting your own government? I mean, that requires an immense, almost unimaginable amount of empathy.
It really does. And if you look at the mechanics of his life, that empathy wasn't like a sudden political pivot.
No.
No, it was the direct, natural result of his linguistic immersion. Think back to how he learned those languages.
Okay.
He didn't learn them from a book in a library in Washington, D.C. He spent his entire life listening to Native Americans speak. When you learn a language organically by sitting by a fire, sharing meals, and trading goods, you don't just learn vocabulary.
You learn how they think.
Exactly. You learn their syntax, which dictates their worldview.
Yeah.
You learn their humor, their struggles, their family structure.
That is so true.
Carson's lifelong immersion meant he couldn't view the frontier as just a blank piece of paper to be conquered.
Which is exactly how the politicians back east saw it.
Right. He saw a highly complex human landscape. He understood the desperation of the Utes and Apaches because he could actually speak to them directly, hear their specific grievances, and fully comprehend the devastating impact that his own maps were having on their lives.
Wow. You can't organically learn a language without immersing yourself in the humanity of the speakers.
Exactly.
That is profound, and it stands in such stark contrast to how his legacy was handled.
Oh, completely.
Because Carson lived this incredibly dense, morally complicated, multifaceted life. I mean, going from a traumatized 9-year-old laborer to a multilingual brigadier general trying to mitigate the destruction of the cultures he lived among. But American pop culture immediately grabbed his name and just flattened him into an easily consumable legend.
The commodification of Kit Carson's life happened incredibly fast, even while he was still alive.
Really?
Oh, yeah. His life was highly sensationalized in inexpensive mass-market short stories known as dime novels.
It's so funny to think about those dime novels because they were essentially the 19th century version of an Instagram filter.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. You take this very complex reality of an illiterate diplomat trying to navigate a morally gray frontier, and you just smooth over all the complicated, messy edges to sell a simple, action-packed cowboy story to the masses.
That pristine, uncorrupted legend was memorialized for decades. You see it repeated in countless Western-themed movies, and very famously in the television show The Adventures of Kit Carson, which aired in the early 1950s.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
The TV Carson was a standard hero with a white hat, riding around saving the day. It wasn't until modern historical examinations that the full, complicated picture of the real man started to come back into focus.
We see that in the 2006 book Blood and Thunder, which is a massive epic that examines the reality of his life and his conflicting roles in great detail.
Such a good book.
And more recently, the 2018 History Channel documentary series Frontiersman explored his actual impact.
These modern historical deep dives remind us of the physical reality of his life. Carson blazed literal trails through the mud and snow for others to follow. But the sources we are looking at today make a really fascinating thematic pivot here.
Yeah, they do.
We move from the heavy geopolitical reality of the 19th century to a children's song.
I love this transition so much. The song is from the children's songbook, and it's called To Be a Pioneer.
Read the lyrics for us.
The lyrics are, "You don't have to push a handcart, leave your family dear, or walk 1,000 miles or more to be a pioneer. You do need to have great courage, faith to conquer fear, and work with might for a cause that's right, to be a pioneer."
The song completely redefines the concept of a pioneer for a modern audience.
It really does.
It strips away the 19th century trappings, the handcarts, the topographical maps, the thousands of miles of walking, and distills the essence of a pioneer into internal character traits.
Right.
It's about courage. It's about facing fear. It's about working for a right cause.
It takes this massive, dusty, historical epic of Kit Carson and suddenly turns it into a mirror for you, the listener, today. The song is directly asking, do you think of yourself as a pioneer when you make the right choices and lead others along good paths in your own life?
It challenges the listener to realize that blazing a trail isn't just about geography anymore. It's about leadership and character.
Which perfectly encapsulates what we set out to do today. We followed this unbelievable journey of Kit Carson, a kid whose father died when he was 9, who never went to school, who couldn't read a single word.
Yep.
Yet he becomes a multilingual mountain man, the indispensable cartographic memory of the American West, a brigadier general, and an empathetic advocate for the tribes he lived among.
The ultimate pathfinder's pathfinder.
He was a man who succeeded not in spite of his harsh circumstances, but because he adapted to them so completely.
And that leaves us with a lingering thought that I want you to mull over after you finish listening today. Carson's complete inability to read was, by any standard metric, a massive disadvantage.
Oh, total.
It should have kept him in poverty his entire life. Yet that exact deficit is what forced his brain to develop unparalleled skills in spatial observation, memory, and spoken language.
Wow.
Those organic skills are what ultimately made him completely indispensable to a nation that was trying to map the unknown.
So as you look at your own life and your own career right now, what perceived disadvantage or missing tool might actually be the exact thing forcing you to blaze a totally new trail?
Such a good question.
What if the thing you think is holding you back is actually forcing you to develop a skill no one else has?
Sometimes the map we are given isn't the map we actually need. You have to learn to read the landscape for yourself.
Remember that the next time you feel like you're navigating your life without an instruction manual, Thank you so much for joining us today. Keep exploring, conquer those fears, and go chart your own paths forward. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us for this day in his story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in his story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.